I'm talking with Aladdin Ullah, a playwright, comedian, actor, writer from New York. His plays in progress include Halal Brothers, The Accidental Feminists, Ali Baba and the Soul Brother. So, Aladdin, you're a stand-up comedian, you're a playwright, you're a performer. You've been around, you've seen the rise and fall of interest in comedians, actors, and all sorts of entertainers who talk about South Asian and immigrant life in the United States. What has changed in recent years, and what kinds of stories do you think are not getting told?
Well, I think the audiences have changed. I think the audience, there's more of a demand for characters that have some depth and nuance. Whereas I think, when I started, whatever, 25 years ago, there wasn't really a voice of hearing South Asians with nuance. You just get like the stereotypes. You get the typical Apu kind of character working in a convenience store, a cab driver, a terrorist. So I think as audiences have gotten older and the generation, as we enter a millennium world, a generation, I think there's a demand for it, as well as I think the face of people behind the camera are changing. So you have executive producers and writers who are wanting to have a voice of a perspective that's a little more nuanced than the cliche. So I also like to think that, in many ways, Black Lives Matter has had a good influence overall in mass media, and that we're questioning, the images that we see, and who controls those images is the key. I know when I started in the '90s, I was one of the first comedians to do a self-produced show, and we didn't rely on the comedy clubs. We went and booked our own room, got our own comedians, and in like '94, '95, we got in the New York Times. And Mel Watkins, who wrote a book on he wrote a book on Richard Pryor, and he was sort of the expert on comedy. He came out, much to my surprise. I wrote him a letter, and he showed up and loved what we were doing. And in that article, you can see it. It's on Google. You could Google it. It was like, hear the one about the comics with the cause. And I felt I was on a mission to do comedy that was a little deeper than just jokes. This generation kind of gets that. That's the kind of comedy that's welcome, social, political. And now you've got Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, Hassan Minaj. So you have. It's almost like the comedians are training the audience how to laugh at stuff that's thought provoking. So I think the audience kind of caught up to a world of comedians that wanted to be more than a stereotype.
And what do you think about the audience for that in the theater of New York today?
Yeah, well, I have mixed feelings. I think there is an audience. The problem with that is that the gatekeepers are preventing it from happening. So, like, I always feel like hip hop is a great paradigm for like how it should be done. I was a baby. I grew up where, in the late '70s, early '80s, the hip hop artists, the graffiti artists, the dancers, the MCs, they couldn't get into the clubs. So the party was going on outside. It was happening on the park. People were dancing on the street, and it was a real party on the street. There was a vibe. So it's like, you didn't have to go to a club. Eventually, the people downtown were coming uptown to see Grandmaster Flash in the Bronx, to see, the Furious Five rap in the Bronx, and then what was basically a street sort of art became mainstream. So I think theater is so far behind, because if the only thing we're excited about is telling revisionist history through Alexander Hamilton, then that's a sad state for theater.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, which hopefully we'll talk a bit about here, is within the world of South Asians in the United States and globally, one part of that world is the world of Bangladeshi people, voices, stories, experiences. And how do you feel that those stories and those experiences are or are not included in theater, performance, in the world of the arts as you see them?
For me, being Bangladeshi, I feel we've been left out of history. Even amongst the South Asian circle, Bangladesh doesn't get the love that it deserves. So I recall when I was doing stand-up comedy, I got invited to these South Asian conferences like in the late '90s and 2000s, and I remember this is one of the funniest moments is when PBS did a documentary. It was like 2003 or four. It was called Daisies, South Asians in New York. I was in the studio at PBS and WNET, and you had these academics that I was on a panel with, and they were talking about like how great America was and how great it was for Indians to migrate here after the Immigration Act. And I was like, wait a minute, time out. Before 1965, Bengalis were here. They were here during the Chinese Exclusion Act, so they weren't even supposed to be here. They snuck here, couldn't speak the language. That's like me going to Sweden and opening up a Mexican restaurant. They were able to survive in a time where America was going through its most turbulent time, create their own survival by owning their own businesses. These were Bangladeshis. And I said that as a joke. And I said, wasn't nobody rolling out the red carpet for Bangladeshis? Our stories need to be told because no one is telling them. The immigrant story is very complicated. And the Bangladeshis that came to New York primarily have one of the most fascinating stories. So I feel like our stories have not even we haven't even explored like beginning the story. So I feel like if if a dopey comedian like me can make stories of it, then I feel like that's the it's almost like destiny. I have to break those doors open because I feel like no one is challenging the status quo.
That brings me to the play in progress that I would love to hear you speak about in some depth, about the accidental feminist. It's partially about Bangladesh, it's partially about traveling to Bangladesh, it's partially about stories of intimacy and romance, and tell us more about that.
Well, when I was doing my documentary, the last part of filming was for me to go to Bangladesh, and I went in 2015. And when I went in 2015, once again, this is the dopey comedian that doesn't know about politics. When I went in 2015, a lot of the bloggers were killed during that time. Abhijit Roy wrote this great essay called The Virus of Faith. He was killed early in the year. He was massacred. He was hacked to death on the street. So I went there right in the middle of all of that turbulence. And so it was an interesting time because I had last gone to Bangladesh in the late 70s when I was a baby. So my only recollection of Bangladesh was this sort of like romantic land that my parents pictured in my head about, liberation and a young nation and the promise of a better future. So in my mind, I was drinking that Kool-Aid. When I got there, it was like Muslim extremism, and it was a country that had a different vibe. And I couldn't believe how much of the patriarchy had dominated that country. And I was the American that was trying to figure out what had happened to Bangladesh. And I don't want to sound like the American who knows everything. I felt like I wanted to be a sponge to figure out what is happening in a country that had all this promise that is now being taken over by these extremists who have these sort of absolute views of Islam. And to think that, people were dying for the ability and the freedom to question made me wonder, wow, what's happening at that time in 2015? So, I've had some time to reflect on it, and I really wanted to write about that time and what it was like to be a guy from New York who was from a totally liberal, open minded way of life. I mean, I grew up in the birth of hip hop. So I felt like art is something that we should have the freedom to practice. Yet in Bangladesh, writers and artists weren't able to be themselves.
Having stories and plays about interracial relationships, conflicts, and dramatic tensions in which South Asian people are the protagonists. This is a pretty rare situation, and I think that in Halal Brothers you do that. And to my knowledge, I have not encountered a play that does what that play does. And there are a few issues that would be wonderful to learn more about from you, about your process, about the kinds of issues that you encountered in writing and thinking about it. And then when it comes to pre-1971, what we now would call Bangladeshi people, but at that time would be East Pakistani people,
Yeah.
how that element of your history, of all of our histories, comes into the picture. And this, again, I don't think I've ever seen a play about anything like that.
I'm trying to take, the research that I've, found and trying to find out about my parents and that group of Bangladeshi men that immigrated here, trying to like use the inspiration for those diasporic stories along with my experiences. So it's kind of finding the sort of the perfect world of how to have the first generation interact with the sort of second generation, the American born. And so growing up in East Harlem, I interacted with a lot of African American and Puerto Rican. So I feel like when I look at theater or when I look at the arts, I think about a world that I want to relate to and identify with. And I find that a lot of theater is predominantly white or it has a white aesthetic. So I'm trying to write characters that reflect the way that I was brought up in. That I grew up, Muslim in a Bangladeshi household, but outside that home, I was surrounded in an environment of Puerto Rican, Dominican, and African American. So I wanted my work to kind of reflect that world of interaction and that intersectional type of world. I feel like theater is the one place I'd like to try and explore because film and TV is so difficult because you have to go through, like there's more gatekeepers you have to go through film and TV, and I just feel like with theater it's just you and the audience. So as a comedian, I've been so in love with live performance that I wanted to create work that people could see live. I don't see a lot of images of people who are poor or working class that are represented in theater. I think theater now is trying to jump on the bandwagon, but for a long time, there really wasn't a lot of work that represented multicultural, people or interracial relationships. There just wasn't a lot of the melting of two worlds together on stage. So I wanted to at least have my work reflect that.
Tell us a bit about not just reflecting that world, but the other parts of the world, Puerto Rican, Dominican, African American, African diasporic people that are in the theater as well. One of the issues that I think we all face is how that interaction happens. There's a lot to think about when it comes to let's say the white majoritarian views of or practices of theater or playwriting, but what about everyone else and the kinds of interactions at that level? And does that inform your practice, or does that come up in terms of writing a play like this? It's both personal, of course, but what about the various facets of that world?
When I think about theater, I think about what's the kind of theater that I want to see, and what's a theater that speaks to me. So I mean, like you take a play like Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun. It's a working class family, and it's about upward mobility, but systematic racism is preventing them from having upward mobility. So I remember seeing the film first and not realizing that it was a play, thinking that these were um, sort of upper middle class African Americans that wanted to move forward, but they were prevented from doing so. And then as I got older and I discovered August Wilson, I think August Wilson, Amiri Baraka, and then later Lynn Nottage and those playwrights, they really spoke to me. And I felt like they were talking about people that were dealing with a sort of social injustice due to race and economic sort of apartheid in America. And I felt that that work was fascinating. So years ago, when I was kind of going through sort of a crossroad in my comedy career, I saw Ruben Santiago Hudson's Lackawanna Blues, and I couldn't believe like the sheer like beauty of seeing one person on stage create this world of multiple characters with a musician on stage. And I couldn't describe it, but I knew whatever Ruben was doing, that's the direction that I wanted to go. And I just thought, man, this is such a play about the underdog, but told with a nuance and understanding of race, of African American and Hispanics, that I just said, this is what I would like to kind of explore as a writer. how do you give dignity and a humanity and a platform for people that are not being represented in the arts, in film, TV, and theater?
There's two different kinds of resonances, I think, that emerge in your work and in discussions with you, and the kind of sentiments that we get in a play like Halal Brothers, for example. One is this really detailed world of a place like New York City, where lines of difference sometimes don't get represented at all in the theater or in film. The kind of
Yeah,
actual ways that people relate to one another, that are not always pretty, but there are
yeah,
complicated, and that, I think, is there. There's another relationship, which is to Bangladesh. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about that in when it comes to playwriting, to the theater, to, as you said, about certain groups get represented, certain groups don't, but within representations of
yeah,
South Asian people, I think Bangladeshi voices are relatively limited.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny because Bangladeshis probably are the most marginalized, if that's the word we could use for South Asians. They're not really given the love in the arts, and they're not also given as much of the credit as being part of the first diaspora to really be entrepreneurs. And that's something that I find amazing is that Bangladeshis come from an extreme poverty in the villages, and yet they were able to come to America at a time at the turn of the century and create their own businesses. So, they sacrificed a lot and they weren't the most political, but they were able to create a world where they were able to sustain a life for them and have families. And some of those families were mixed marriages. They married African Americans and Hispanic women. And so I feel like those characters, those people who are marginalized, they don't really have a voice. They're not really represented in in film, TV, and theater. So, and if they are, it's very like limited. It's caricatures. It's very stereotypical. There isn't a nuanced portrayal of those kind of South Asians. The story of Bangladeshis marrying African Americans and Puerto Ricans and Hispanics and having to assimilate to a culture that doesn't really want their humanity. It only wants their labor. That's a story that I think needs to be told. So I really feel like that's an unwritten that's a history that's gone. It's a lost history. So I wanted to find a way to tell that story dramatically.
Telling that kind of a story does many things. One thing that it does, I think, one entry point is that before 1971, between 1947 and 1971, the people who come from that place that we now call Bangladesh, this term Bangladesh was not used in that way. There was no nation state of Bangladesh.
Yeah,
And the people of that region, their relationship to Islam, to Pakistan, to India, to the United States, these are things that are radically different then compared to the late 20th century and compared to now. And so it's a really important slice of time where things were really different than they are now. Yet we recognize that moment. We know that moment. We feel that. We know what it's like in the scenes that you wrote in Halal Brothers about this moment in the 1960s, when there are such people in New York, and they're making it and they're trying. What their life is like is hard to tell with the categories that we have now. It's not just a
yeah.
Bangladeshi American story. It's a really complicated one. So, could you say a bit about that part of either your practice, your writing, your family, the kind of elements of that history that are alive?
Yeah, I found the connection to my father's generation because, we struggle with identity. Am I American? Am I South Asian? Am I Bangladeshi? Am I a New Yorker? Yet, my father died in the '80s, and in his lifetime, he went from being Indian to East Pakistan in 1947 after partition, and then in 1971, he was Bangladeshi, and yet at this the entire time his relatives always saw him as an American, but for me, my father was a fob. So it's like how we are identified sometimes is unfortunately how other people categorize us and label us. And Bangladeshis have a unique history because in the 19th century they were like three different identities. Because he came here in the late 20s, early 30s, all the way up to when he died in the 1980s. So once again, that's a fascinating history. I always identify with being from New York. I always make the joke that I'm about as Bangladeshi as Pee Wee Herman because I don't really, culturally, I wasn't raised in Bangladesh. So my father and his generation, I think they have a different relationship with Bangladesh and that they're from the village, but they have a complicated relationship in how they view back home because like my father never became an American citizen because I think in his heart he was Bangladeshi. He was never able to let that go, but he was caught between America and Bangladesh. Whereas me and like our generation, we're like American to the 10th power. I mean, I love to visit Bangladesh, but I know when I'm in Bangladesh how American I am. So I feel like that sort of gray area is the stuff that's the gold of what to write about. That feeling of identity and not really knowing where you belong. And in the Halal Brothers, there's two brothers, one who's determined to make that halal store work. Then there's the younger brother who comes here to reluctantly go to City College to help his brother with the business. But he falls in love with a black girl and he starts surrendering to what is the culture and the cadence and the beat and the rhythms of Harlem. And I feel in many ways like that's what being South Asian in America is. We're caught between two worlds, that we have to be loyal to our parents and, do the namaz, do Juma, do Ramadan, eat, and, be respectful to our parents. But then, when we leave home, we want to hang out with the girls, listen to hip hop, and go to a Knick game. So we're caught between those two worlds. And I just felt there really wasn't a lot of like there weren't a lot of stories that captured that. Now I think the tide is turning. You've got Rami, you've got Hassan Minaj, Aziz Ansari, but even still, there's a sort of glass ceiling to how deep you can really go with that work. Because I feel like comedy puts kind of, in many ways, like a dead end to how deep you can go. And I want to jump off the cliff and really explore the deeper stories.
Do you feel that there are precedents, plays, and or any other kind of precedent specifically about South Asian migrants in this context? I mean, you've spoken a lot about the African American theater, which is so inspirational for so many purposes and in so many ways. But do you think that anything like this has happened in the United States in a manner that can do what you just said, which is to capture what this experience is like?
I think there are South Asian writers that start off trying to do that, but it's almost like when they're writing, they're looking over their shoulder going, I got to make this white artistic director happy. So we got to make the white people happy. So it becomes plays that are pandering to a specific white audience. So it may start off with a wink like, listen, I'm going to talk about the South Asians, but we're going to end up making white people feel good at the end of the play. So I don't want to do that. That's the formula that works to get produced. And it's not necessarily the road that I want to go down. And I think that there are South Asian playwrights that have explored how South Asians are looked upon in society, but I think they're pandering. So I don't want to pander. I'm trying not to pander. The people who are, saying I'm down with Black Lives Matter were the people that were rejecting a lot of plays by playwrights of color that had any of this nuance. And if you look at theater today, it's kind of like the same type of plays. It's like, it'll be a play about an African American or a person of color, and then it's like, they experience a conflict, and then at the end, the person gets it resolved, and white people win at the end of the play. It's just like it's the same formula. And it's like I said, I don't mind talking about Hamilton because Lin-Miranda is going to survive no matter what I say. But if Hamilton is what theater is most excited about, that tells you a lot about where we are, not just from a creative level, but from an audience level. Like they've trained the audience what to like. And see, what attracted me to hip hop wasn't compromising for an audience in the theater or audience in the club. Hip hop was all about the street. Like if you look at Hassan Minaj, that's a great example. Hassan is basically on Netflix, and a lot of his audiences, they are South Asian, but they're also African American and they're also white. But it's like a really sort of young audience that is tired of the same old formula. They want something that's real. So I have faith in the millennial audience, but it's almost like we have to train the audience, and in theater, it's just not as progressive as a streaming audience or it's just theater is so far behind, unfortunately. It's an archaic form of the arts controlled by white people who are the gatekeepers.
Well, do you see any changes on the horizon in that context? Because you mentioned Black Lives Matter, which that can be fully co-opted and appropriated in different ways. But
Yeah.
is there any indication that the theater, as you mentioned, is an archaic form? Is that really just here to stay? And then the actual politics of moving theater forward happen elsewhere. They don't happen in subscription-based professional theaters in the United States. They happen in other spaces. Or do you think that those spaces are going to be more open to different kinds of stories, different kinds of playwrights, different kinds of narratives?
I don't have the answer, but what's the sad reality is that there are a lot of playwrights, say like Christopher Diaz, who did Labyrinth Entrance to Chad did. He ended up working on Glow. Rada Blank, who was in my group at the Public Theater, she's having an amazing career in TV, writing for Empire. She's got to have it. She just won the Cannes Best Director. She won the Sundance Best Director award. And in my conversations with them, they're basically cynical about theater, and they're saying, "Why spend all this energy in theater, and you're making crumbs compared to going in TV or streaming, Netflix, Hulu, and Prime, where you can make a living as a writer." So in my heart, I'd like to believe theater is the place, but it's almost like theater has become the audition place for writers, so they can make their living on TV, on cable TV or streaming TV.
I'm not sure if everyone in our communities is really that invested. I mean,
No.
the audience is not within, and so there's a real disconnect. Now, on that topic, I'm curious if you could say a bit more about how you cultivate a community. As a playwright working on this kind of material, what kind of reactions do you get from different kinds of playwrights, actors, and other
Well,
people in this industry?
Well, I want to point out, just to go back, in the '90s when I got out of high school, the way you made it as a comedian is you stay at a club for like 5-6 years. You get discovered in the club, and then if you're lucky, you get 5 minutes on a TV show. And I felt that there was something wrong about that because it was an entrenched racism in these clubs, like the comic strip Catch a Rising Star. So the only times that I could get on was African American night and Latino night. So I used to make a joke. I said, so why is it that I'm good enough, and me and the African American and Hispanic comedians, we're only good for one night out of the month? What about the 29 other white nights? And so, I basically, the first 5 years of my comedy career, I was performing in black comedy clubs, but I still felt something was wrong. So in 1994, if you look it up, I did the first self-produced show in New York with a roster of all multi-ethnic comedians. And my only rule was you couldn't do any like dirty jokes. It had to be all social, political material. And I'd have guest comedians come on, like I'd have Dave Chappelle and whatnot. They'd come in. And so the New York Times, came and they did a feature on the show. And I had said, that comedy is in a sad state because of the entrenched racism. Now, as a result of that, I got banned from the comedy clubs. I didn't care because I figured you're not giving me the stage time anyway, so why should I care? And I just wished that there were more comedians that were speaking out, but they're all saying, well, it's great what you said, but, I can't. be outspoken. So here we are, fast forward, almost 30 years later, and I see what's happening in theater is almost identical to that. That the playwrights who are South Asian, who are African American, who are Hispanic, they don't want to speak out because they feel like then they're going to lose their 15 minutes. So whenever I try to do a show in New York, when I did my solo show here a year and a half ago, I tried to cultivate, South Asians and African Americans, and you have to like be really creative and how you bring audiences. And even the more established audience playwrights like Lynn Nottage and David Henry Wong, they talk about how they have to work with the white theater, the marketing people and whatnot, and how to cultivate getting an audience of color in. So it's a challenge just getting people of color to come see your show. So this is why it's like you got to be creative, in marketing and audience development. And when they do come, it's interesting. It makes me think of a line that Richard Pryor said that I love. Years ago, Barbara Walters said that when he performed in black clubs, he had such a loyal following because he, in the late 60s, really developed in Oakland. He was kind of a safe comedian. He was doing impressions of Bill Cosby. And then he stopped doing that and went to Oakland with Paul Mooney and really worked on his act. And it was predominantly black audiences in Oakland and Berkeley and like the Black Panthers, Huey Newton. He was performing for like a leftist black audience. Then when he came to LA, she said she noticed that his audience was mixed. Do you feel like you're losing something? And he said, no. I want a black person and a white person to be sitting next to each other. So when I talk about race or social injustice, I want that white person to say, oh my God, does this happen in America? I want the black person sitting next to that white person going, every day, Jack, every day. And I believe when theater works, that's what happens.
We've already talked about, and those of us who are involved in this world, we know very well the limits of the institutional world. Then there's form and then there's content. And I was curious about if you could speak about new work that you're doing. I know you're writing a musical, and about content of new work that you're developing and just what it's about, how it came about, what you see for the future of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to do a musical, which is probably the most difficult thing to write. And, it's inspired by, a movement of South Asians that were coming to Harlem in the 60s. And, I felt that there was an energy of, a movement that I think the music of that time of the 60s was so inspiring. You had Motown, you had Stax, you had the doo-wop sound, you had Sam and Dave, and there was something about the music that was so captivating. And I recall that my father said that my father is, from the villages of Bangladesh, and he was saying that there was an energy of the music that was captivating in the 60s. So I connected to that because I grew up, in the 80s as a child that was just moved by the music and energy of hip hop that was in the streets and in the yards and all of the parks that were all around East Harlem and the Bronx. So I felt like I could relate to this movement of music that moved immigrants and African Americans. So I felt I wanted to write a musical about a person from Bangladesh, or at that time was East Pakistan, who came to New York and worked in a restaurant downtown and felt they didn't belong in that restaurant. But yet when they moved to Harlem, they felt that Harlem was a place that felt like home because of the welcoming, of a person of color in Harlem. Everyone was black, so you didn't feel out of place. There was a movement in the 60s where it seemed like Harlem was getting really progressive. You had the Nation of Islam. You had that juxtaposed with, City College that was going through its own transformation of the Black arts movement and Black arts studies. So Harlem was an interesting time in the 60s. So I wanted to kind of use almost Harlem as a character that had his own rhythm and had his own music with this character who comes to Harlem and wants to do something more than just be a laborer. And when he finds this music, he finds a connection to it. And then when he goes to the library, he sees a Bengali student from Colombia who's handing out flyers for the protest. and he lies to her and says that he's a student at Columbia, and when he's just basically, you know, a laborer. So it's a combination of like blues, rock and soul, and Bengali folk music. And I'm trying to, you know, do a hybrid of all, you know. So that's probably the most ambitious thing that I'm working on right now.
And this, we've touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about how your sense of how people in this world, playwrights, producers, actors, who are not connected to these histories, they're not connected to these politics, they're not connected to these lives, how they interpret and relate to all this, what happens in a process that at some level is magical. You know, any kind of story that is sincere can touch people across lines of difference. But what happens when these stories are out there? And what has your experience been like?
Well, I can tell you as a comedian, when I used to do the little 5 or 6 minutes I would do on TV, people were really connected because they saw someone that looked like them. And, you know, I was the first comedian talking about being Muslim and just joking about what it was like growing up and being the reluctant Muslim. Like a lot of teenagers identified with that. So I remember when I did BET's Comic View, which was on a black station on BET, like there were African Americans that connected because they knew what it was like to be an outsider. So although like, you know, it was a South Asian Bangladeshi experience, felt it was universal because it was me kind of rebelling against my mother, just being defiant. So I think it's important to see not just a good Muslim, but also like realistic portrayals of teenagers and young adults, uh, you know, struggling with their identity, struggling with, you know, parents trying to make them something that they don't feel comfortable with, which is religious and whatnot. So, I mean, in England, you had Qureshi, who was writing about these issues with My Beautiful Laundrette and My Son the Fanatic. But in America, I didn't see any of those images. So I was going on TV talking about taboo things, which was about being Muslim. And I feel like in America, we're scared to kind of talk about Muslims, you know, being rebellious or Muslims that are not willing participants. And, you know, you have to be willing to kind of challenge the audience and say, well, there happens to be a lot of Muslims and Bangladeshis that, you know, that smoke weed, eat pork, but, you know, when it's time to go to mosque on Friday, we just willingly go because that's what our parents do. There has to be more than just a stereotype. And I think audiences are dying, longing, craving for those kind of stories.